The afternoon light fell through lace curtains in golden streams, illuminating particles of dust that danced like tiny spirits in the Philadelphia bedroom. Margaret Henley sat perfectly still beside her husband's bed, her right hand clutching a small glass bottle, her left hand wrapped around fingers that had once been strong enough to set broken bones but now felt as delicate as autumn leaves. "Doctor." Charles Henley's face had taken on the waxy pallor of a man already half departed from this world. At 48, he looked 70. The cancer had consumed him from the inside out over 18 terrible months, eating away at the vital, confident physician who had once strode through hospital corridors with purpose in every step. Now he could barely lift his head from the pillow. Margaret was 42, though the mirror lately showed her a woman who could pass for 50. Grief had threaded silver through her dark hair. Sleepless nights had carved hollows beneath her green eyes. 7 months of caring for Charles alone, after the money ran out and the household staff had to be dismissed, had worn her hands raw and bent her spine with exhaustion she felt in her very bones. The morphine bottle caught the light, amber liquid glowing like captured sunlight. She had filled it at the pharmacy that morning, using the last of their credit. The pharmacist had given her a long, measuring look, as if he could read the intention written on her soul. She had met his gaze without flinching, paid, and walked out with her chin high and her heart breaking. Charles stirred, a moan escaping his cracked lips. The sound cut through Margaret like a blade. She reached for the water glass, lifted his head with practiced gentleness, helped him sip. Most of it ran down his chin. She dabbed it away with a cloth already damp from previous attempts. When his eyes opened, they were the same warm brown she had fallen in love with 20 years ago, before time and illness had stolen everything else. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Margaret." She leaned closer, her ear near his mouth. "I'm here, my love. I'm here." "How long?" His breath rattled in his chest like dry seeds in a gourd. She knew what he was asking. Not how long until death came naturally, but how long she would make him endure this suffering. The question he had been asking in various forms for 3 weeks now. "Charles, please, don't ask me again." His fingers tightened on hers with surprising strength. "My father, you remember." She closed her eyes. Yes, she remembered. Charles's father had died of the same cancer 6 years earlier. The old man had lingered for 3 agonizing months, screaming for mercy, begging his son to end it. Charles, bound by law and medical ethics, had refused. He had sat beside that bed night after night, listening to howls of pain that seemed barely human, and done nothing but administer doses of morphine too small to bring true relief. Charles had never forgiven himself for that obedience to law over compassion. "You loved him," Charles whispered now, "but you love me more, don't you?" The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. "More than my own life." "Then prove it." His eyes held hers with desperate intensity. "Don't let me die like he did. 3 months of hell. I can't, Margaret, I can't." She shook her head, but the gesture was weak, defeated. They both knew her resistance was crumbling. It had been crumbling for days, eroded by every scream of pain, every night spent listening to him beg in his morphine dreams for someone, anyone, to make it stop. "The law," she managed. "Charles? They could arrest me, hang me. The law doesn't live in this room." His breathing came harder now, each word costing him. "Just you and me. Just us, like it's always been." He was right. The servants were gone. The last visiting nurse had quit a week ago, unable to bear the sounds of his suffering. Their friends had gradually stopped calling, uncomfortable with the reality of slow death. Even their pastor had taken to sending brief notes instead of visiting, as if terminal illness might be contagious. They were alone. Completely, utterly alone. "If you love me," Charles said, and now his voice held an edge she had never heard before, something between plea and command. "You'll do this. You'll give me this one last gift." Margaret looked at the morphine bottle. The physician who had prescribed it, an old colleague of Charles's, had written clear instructions on the label. 1 spoonful every 4 hours for pain. Do not exceed. 3 spoonfuls would bring relief, 4 would bring sleep, 5 would bring an end. If they come, she said, her voice strange and distant to her own ears. If the police come, what do I do? Charles's lips curved in something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so sad. You run, promise me. Don't let them make you pay for being merciful. Run where? He released her hand, reached beneath his pillow with agonizing slowness. When his hand emerged, it held a folded envelope, yellowed with age. Lucas Morrison, San Marcos, Texas. I saved his son's life in 1870. Told him someday I might need the favor returned. Margaret took the envelope with numb fingers. The address was written in Charles's younger, stronger hand. San Marcos, Texas. It might as well have been the moon. He'll help you, Charles said. He's a good man, owes me everything. When this is done, when I'm gone, you take the westbound train and you don't look back. I can't leave you. I'll be past caring. His smile was ghastly, a death's head grin. Margaret, my love, my only love. Let me go. She measured the morphine into a spoon with shaking hands. 1 spoonful. 2. Her hands continued to pour as if moving of their own accord. 3, 4, 5. Charles watched her with eyes that held only gratitude and love. When she brought the spoon to his lips, he opened his mouth like a child taking medicine, trusting absolutely in the hand that fed him. He swallowed. Then again. Then a third time. Thank you, he whispered. Already his eyes were beginning to glaze, the morphine working its way through his ravaged system. Thank you for loving me enough. Margaret set the spoon aside and lay down beside him on the narrow bed, careful not to jostle his wasted frame. She fitted herself against him as she had done 1,000 nights in their marriage, her head on his shoulder, her arm across his chest. His breathing began to slow. The terrible rattle eased. His hand found hers and held it with the last of his strength. Not murder, he murmured, his words slurring now. Mercy. You gave me mercy. Remember that. I'll remember. And Margaret, when you get to Texas, find someone who makes you laugh again. Promise me. She couldn't speak. She nodded against his shoulder, feeling the tears soak into his nightshirt. Charles Henley drew 3 more breaths. The first was deep and almost peaceful. The second was shallow, barely there. The third never came. Margaret lay beside her husband's body as the afternoon light faded to evening, then to night. She lay there until the room grew cold, and his skin beneath her hand lost its warmth. She lay there until she had no tears left, only a hollow exhaustion that felt like her soul had been scraped clean. At midnight she finally rose. She washed his face with gentle hands, closed his eyes, straightened his nightclothes, made him decent for whatever came next. Then she packed a single small bag, taking only what she could carry. She left the morphine bottle on the bedside table, evidence of what she had done. Let them find it. Let them know she had loved him enough to free him from his pain. She tucked the envelope with Lucas Morrison's address into her pocket, along with what little money remained. Charles's wedding ring she slipped onto a chain around her neck, where it would rest against her heart. At dawn, she walked out of the house that had been her home for 20 years. She did not look back. 3 days later, standing in the offices of Charles's attorney, she learned the full scope of what her husband had hidden from her. The debts were enormous. The house would have to be sold, along with everything in it, and still there would not be enough to satisfy the creditors. The medical practice had been mortgaged twice over. There was no money. There had been no money for more than a year. And then came the worst news of all. The visiting nurse, Ellen Brennan, had raised questions with the Philadelphia Medical Board. She claimed she had overheard suspicious conversations and noticed irregularities in the morphine supply. The board had begun a quiet inquiry, not yet involving police, but the attorney warned it was only a matter of time. About overhearing Margaret and Charles's final conversation, about her suspicions that Dr. Henley's death had not been entirely natural. The Philadelphia Medical Board was opening an investigation. The police were asking questions. It was only a matter of time before someone decided that Mercy looked an awful lot like murder. The attorney, a kind-faced man named Wilson, who had known Charles for 30 years, had leaned across his desk with urgency in his eyes. "Mrs. Henley, I'm advising you as a friend, not as your legal counsel. Leave Philadelphia, today, right now. Go somewhere they can't find you until this blows over." "Will it blow over?" she had asked, though she already knew the answer. Wilson had looked away. "I don't know, but I do know that grief-stricken widows don't fare well in front of juries, especially when the charge is murder." So Margaret Henley had done exactly what Charles had made her promise. She had run. The westbound train had carried her across Pennsylvania, through Ohio, into the vast heartland of America. She watched the landscape transform outside her window, the ordered eastern cities giving way to endless prairie, civilization thinning out mile by mile until there was nothing but grass and sky and the occasional lonely farmhouse. She changed trains in St. Louis, then again in San Antonio. Each transfer took her farther from everything she had known, deeper into a world that felt increasingly foreign. The other passengers gave her strange looks, this well-dressed Eastern widow traveling alone with a single shabby bag, and eyes that held too much sorrow for polite conversation. On the final leg to San Marcos, she sat across from a cowboy who smelled of horses and honest sweat. He had tipped his hat to her politely, then dozed most of the way, his head bumping against the window with the rhythm of the rails. Margaret had envied him his peace. She had not slept properly since the night Charles died. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the weight of that spoon in her hand, saw the trust in his eyes as he swallowed the poison she had given him with love. The train had pulled into Willow Creek, the stop nearest to San Marcos, on an October afternoon when the Texas sun blazed down with a heat Philadelphia never knew. Margaret had stepped onto the platform into air that smelled of dust and distant cattle and something indefinable that might have been freedom or might have been desperation. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the past fall away, and the terror of an uncertain future settle onto her shoulders in its place. Somewhere in this strange land was Lucas Morrison, a man her husband had saved 14 years ago, a man who supposedly owed Charles everything. Margaret had no idea if he would even remember, no idea if the debt he owed a dead man would extend to hiding that man's widow from a murder investigation. She had only one thing left, the courage it had taken to fill that spoon 5 times instead of once. If she had been brave enough to help the man she loved die, she told herself, she could be brave enough to learn how to live. Margaret Henley picked up her bag, straightened her black traveling dress, and walked into town to find out if mercy was a crime in Texas too, or if this wild place might have room for a woman who had loved too fiercely and paid too high a price for compassion. The main street of Willow Creek stretched before her like a judgment. The general store stood between a saloon called the Silver Star and a boarding house that had seen better days. Its false front bore the name Morrison and Son in faded paint, and through the dusty window Margaret could see shelves stocked with everything from flour sacks to ammunition. She pushed open the door. A bell jangled overhead, announcing her arrival. The interior was dim after the brilliant sunlight, and she had to pause to let her eyes adjust. The smell of coffee and leather and dried goods filled her nose, familiar and strange all at once. Behind the counter stood a man sorting through a ledger, his steel-rimmed spectacles perched on a nose that had been broken at least once. His hair, more gray than brown, was neatly combed. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with the muscle of a man who had done hard labor most of his life. He looked up at the sound of the bell, and Margaret watched his face go through a series of expressions in rapid succession: polite inquiry, professional welcome. And then, when she stepped fully into the light and he got a good look at her face, something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, or shock, or both. "Can I help you, ma'am?" His voice was carefully neutral, but his hands had gone still on the ledger. Margaret approached the counter, acutely aware of how she must look. Travel-stained, exhausted. A woman alone in a frontier town, which was unusual enough to draw stares anywhere west of the Mississippi. "I'm looking for Lucas Morrison." The man's knuckles went white on the edge of the counter. "I'm Morrison. Who's asking?" She drew in a breath, then said the words that would either save her or doom her. "My name is Margaret Henley. My husband was Dr. Charles Henley. He said you would remember him." The color drained from Morrison's face. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and Margaret felt her heart sink. He was going to deny it, going to claim he had never known Charles, never owed him anything, never made any promise that might extend to helping the man's widow. Then Morrison's mouth opened, and what came out was not denial but something far worse. "Your husband is dead?" 7 weeks ago. Her voice remained steady through sheer force of will. "Cancer. It was very quick at the end." Morrison turned away, gripping the edge of the counter so hard Margaret heard the wood creak. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath, then another. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with some emotion she could not name. "Dr. Henley saved my boy's life. Year 1870, when the fever took half this county, and the doctors that were left didn't want to waste time on a case they thought was hopeless. My son Ethan was 14, strong as an ox, before the sickness hit him. After, he couldn't move his legs, couldn't hardly breathe." He turned back to face her, and Margaret saw tears standing in his eyes. "Local doctors said let him go peaceful, make him comfortable, and wait for the end. I was ready to do it, God help me. I was ready to give up on my own boy." Morrison pulled off his spectacles, rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. "Then this stranger rode through town. Eastern doctor, folks said, too educated for his own good. He heard about Ethan, came to the house uninvited, took one look at my boy and said, 'This child isn't dying, not if I have anything to say about it.'" Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. This was Charles. This was exactly the kind of thing he would do, the arrogant compassion that had made him both a brilliant physician and an impossible man to live with sometimes. "He stayed 3 weeks, Morrison continued, wouldn't take payment, slept in our barn, worked on Ethan day and night, some kind of treatment he'd learned back east. Gradually, bit by bit, the boy started to improve, started to move his fingers, then his arms. His breathing got stronger." "His legs?" Margaret asked softly. Morrison shook his head. "Never did come all the way back. Ethan walks with a limp to this day." "But he walks, Mrs. Henley. He's alive. He's 28 years old, helps me run this store, and he's alive because your husband wouldn't give up on him." Relief flooded through Margaret so powerfully she had to grip the counter for support. "Then you remember. Charles said you would help me. He said you owed him." Something shifted in Morrison's expression then, a wariness creeping back in. "Help you how?" This was the moment. The point where she either trusted this man or kept running forever. "I'm in trouble, Mr. Morrison. Back in Philadelphia, there are people who believe I helped my husband die, that I gave him too much morphine deliberately." Morrison's eyes went very wide. "Did you?" The question hung between them like a sword. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, he had cancer, Mr. Morrison, the same kind that killed his father. He was in terrible pain. He begged me to help him. So I did." The silence stretched out. Margaret waited for Morrison to order her out of his store, perhaps to call the sheriff. Instead, he surprised her. "And now you're running." "Now I'm trying to stay alive long enough to prove he wanted it, that it was mercy, not murder." Morrison studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "Ma'am, I'm going to be straight with you. What you did, mercy or not, it scares me, makes me think about things I don't want to think about." Margaret felt her heart sink again. "I understand. I'll go. Hold on, I'm not done." Morrison raised a hand. "It scares me because 14 years ago I was ready to give up on my son, ready to let him go, because it seemed like the kind thing to do. Your husband showed me I was wrong, showed me that sometimes the fight is worth it, even when it looks hopeless." He paused, struggling with something. "But I also know what it's like to watch someone you love suffer. My wife died 2 years back. Pneumonia. Quick, thank the Lord. But those last few days she was drowning in her own lungs, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do but watch." Margaret said nothing, sensing he needed to work through this himself. "If she'd asked me to help her go faster," Morrison said slowly, "I don't know what I would have done. Don't know if I'd have had the courage to do it or the courage to refuse. So I can't judge you, Mrs. Henley. I surely can't." "But you can't help me either," Margaret finished for him. "I didn't say that." Morrison glanced toward the back of the store where a door stood half open. "I said it scares me, but Dr. Henley didn't let fear stop him from doing what was right, and I reckon I can't either. You need work. You need a place to stay where questions won't be asked. I might know somewhere." Before Margaret could respond, a voice called from the back room. "Pa? Who you talking to?" A young man emerged, walking with a pronounced limp in his left leg, favoring it with each step. He was tall, well-built despite the disability, with his father's strong features and eyes that held both intelligence and warmth. He stopped short when he saw Margaret, surprise crossing his face. "Ethan," Morrison said, his voice oddly strained. "This is Mrs. Henley." Her husband was Dr. Charles Henley. The effect on Ethan was immediate and profound. His face lit up like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "Dr. Henley's wife, truly?" He crossed to her in 3 quick, limping strides and seized her hand, pumping it with enthusiasm that would have been comical if it hadn't been so clearly genuine. "Ma'am, your husband saved my life. I was dying. Everyone said so, but he wouldn't give up. 3 weeks he worked on me, trying things the other doctors said were nonsense. Look at me now." He released her hand and took a step back, gesturing to himself. "I can walk. I can work. I'm getting married next spring to Mary Beth Cartwright. None of that would have happened without Dr. Henley." Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. This was Charles's legacy. Not the debts, not the investigation, not the whispers of murder. This young man, alive and in love, and planning a future. "He never told me," she said softly, "about you, about coming here." "Doctor." "Henley didn't seem like a man who talked much about his good deeds," Ethan said. "He just did them and moved on." Morrison cleared his throat. "Ethan, Mrs. Henley needs work. I was thinking maybe Jake Caldwell might still be looking for a cook." Ethan's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "The Circle M? That's hard work, ma'am. Real hard. And Jake, well, he's a good man, but he's been through some troubles. The ranch, it's not exactly welcoming these days." "I don't need welcoming," Margaret said firmly. "I need somewhere to be useful, somewhere no one will ask too many questions about where I came from." Father and son exchanged a long look, some communication passing between them that Margaret could not read. Finally, Morrison nodded. "Jake's in town today. Came in for supplies. If you want, I can introduce you." "Please." Morrison came around the counter, gestured for her to follow. They walked to the door, Ethan trailing behind, and Morrison pointed down the street to where a wagon stood outside the feed store. A man was loading 100-pound sacks of grain into the wagon bed with the ease of long practice. Even from a distance, Margaret could see he was tall and lean, with the kind of strength that came from years of physical labor. He wore simple clothes, denim pants, and a blue work shirt, a worn hat pulled low against the sun. "That's Jake Caldwell," Morrison said. "Came to Texas about 10 years back. Bought the Circle M when it was near bankrupt. Built it back up through sheer stubbornness. Lost his wife Sarah to consumption 3 years ago. Been different ever since." They walked toward the wagon. As they approached, the man straightened from his work, pulled off his hat to wipe his brow, and Margaret got her first clear look at his face. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 38 or 40. His face was weathered by sun and wind, carved with lines that spoke of hard living and harder losses. His hair was dark brown, shot through with premature gray at the temples. But it was his eyes that caught her. gray as storm clouds, with a depth of sadness in them that she recognized immediately. Those were the eyes of a man who had watched someone he loved suffer, who had made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. Jake Caldwell's gaze swept over Morrison, then Ethan, then landed on Margaret. He went very still, his expression shifting into something Margaret could not quite read. "Jake," Morrison said, "this is Mrs. Margaret Henley. She's new to Willow Creek, looking for work. I thought you might still be needing a cook at the Circle M." Jake continued to stare at Margaret with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. Finally he spoke, his voice a low drawl that held echoes of education beneath the Texas accent. "You cook for large groups before, Mrs. Henley?" Margaret lifted her chin. "No, but I'm a quick learner, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Circle M isn't just hard work. It's up before dawn, cooking for 15 hungry men 3 times a day, managing supplies, keeping a kitchen in order. It's hot and thankless, and the last 3 women who tried it quit within a month. I won't quit. Jake's eyes narrowed. "You seem mighty sure of that for someone who's never done it." "Mr. Caldwell, I've spent the last 18 months caring for my dying husband. I've done things that would make cooking for Cowboys seem like a pleasant afternoon. I don't scare easily anymore." Something flickered across Jake's face at the mention of her dying husband. He glanced at Morrison, who gave a slight nod that seemed to communicate volumes. "Your husband passed recently?" Jake asked, his voice gentler now. 7 weeks ago. Cancer." Jake looked away, jaw tightening. When he looked back, his expression had shifted again, some of the hardness gone from it. "My wife died of consumption. Took her 6 months. Bad 6 months." He paused. "I understand what it's like to watch that, to feel helpless." Margaret felt the weight of unspoken understanding pass between them. This man knew. Maybe not the specifics, not what she had done, but he knew the terrible helplessness of watching someone you love waste away in pain. "The pay is $20 a month, plus room and board," Jake said abruptly. "You'll have your own room off the kitchen. You'll eat with the hands or alone, your choice. If you can make it through the first week without burning down my kitchen or poisoning my men, we'll talk about making it permanent." "Only a week?" Margaret managed a small smile. "That's not much time to prove myself. Week's all the last cook lasted before she decided ranch life wasn't for her." Jake settled his hat back on his head. "I'm heading back out there now if you want to ride along. Otherwise I can send someone for you tomorrow." Margaret thought of the boarding house, of spending another night alone with her thoughts and her guilt. "I'll come now, if that's all right. I don't have much to pack." Jake nodded. "Get your things. I'll wait." Margaret hurried back to the boarding house where she had left her single bag. Mrs. Patterson, the proprietress, took her money without comment, clearly unsurprised that the strange Eastern widow was leaving after only 1 night. When Margaret returned to the wagon, Jake had finished loading the supplies. He took her bag without asking and placed it in the wagon bed with surprising care, as if it might contain something precious rather than just her few remaining possessions. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand steadying her elbow with courteous formality. Then he climbed up beside her, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue to the horses. As they pulled away from town, Margaret looked back to see Morrison and Ethan standing in front of the store, watching. Ethan raised his hand in farewell. Morrison simply nodded, his expression troubled but resolute. The wagon rolled out of Willow Creek and onto the open prairie. Margaret had thought Philadelphia was big sky country until she saw Texas. Here the sky seemed to go on forever, an endless blue dome broken only by a few scattered clouds that looked like lost sheep. The silence between them stretched comfortable and uncomfortable at once. Jake kept his eyes on the road. Margaret studied the landscape, trying not to think about how far she was from everything she had ever known. Finally, Jake spoke. "Morrison told me your husband saved Ethan's life." "Apparently. I never knew. Charles didn't talk much about his work. Man who saves a life like that, that's a good man." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "He was. He truly was." Another stretch of silence. Then, Almost reluctantly, Jake said, "When Sarah was dying, toward the end, she asked me to help her. Give her more laudanum than the doctor prescribed. Said she couldn't bear another night of struggling to breathe." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. She forced herself to breathe normally, to show no reaction. "I told her no," Jake continued, his voice flat. "Told her it was against the law, against God, that I couldn't do it even if I wanted to." He was quiet for a long moment. The wagon wheels creaked. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass. She died 3 nights later, drowning in her own lungs, looking at me like I'd betrayed her. Jake's knuckles were white on the reins. "I think about that every single day. Wonder if I was righteous or just a coward." Jake was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the creak of wagon wheels and the whisper of wind through grass. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, almost hesitant. "There's something else you should know about me, Mrs. Henley, since we're sharing truths." Margaret turned to look at him. "I came to Texas 10 years ago, but not just to start over. I was running, same as you." He kept his eyes on the road. "Back in Louisiana there was a fire, my family's plantation house. My parents and younger sister died in it. I was the only one who got out." His jaw tightened. "The sheriff said the fire started in the study where I'd been working on the books earlier that evening. Said my lamp must have tipped. Said it was criminal negligence at best, murder at worst, since I stood to inherit everything." Margaret's breath caught. "But you didn't—" "No, I didn't start that fire. But I couldn't prove it, and the sheriff was a friend of my uncle who wanted the estate. So I left before they could arrest me. Changed my name from Jacob Caldwell Beaumont to just Jake Caldwell. Bought land here where nobody asks questions about a man's past." He finally looked at her. "So you see, Mrs. Henley, we're more alike than you knew. We're both running from accusations of killing the people we loved. Difference is, you're guilty of mercy. I'm just guilty of surviving when I should have died with them." Margaret turned to look at him, this stranger who was offering her something she had not expected. Understanding. Perhaps even absolution. "You followed the law," she said quietly. "That takes courage too." "Does it?" Jake's smile was bitter. "Or does it just take fear?" He glanced at her then, and in his eyes she saw the question he was not quite asking, the thing he wanted to know but would not demand she tell him. Margaret looked out at the endless prairie and made a choice. "I gave my husband what he asked for," she said softly. "When he begged me to help him die, I did it. I gave him enough morphine to set him free from the pain." She waited for Jake to stop the wagon, to turn around and take her back to town, to look at her with horror or disgust. Instead, he simply nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. "Then you're braver than I was, or maybe just loved him more than I loved Sarah." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Jake's voice held no accusation, only a terrible sadness. "I let the woman I loved suffer because I was afraid of the consequences. You didn't. That's the difference between us, Mrs. Henley." "The difference is that you'll sleep easy tonight," Margaret said, "and I haven't had a peaceful night's rest since the moment he stopped breathing." Jake was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Morrison told me you might have law trouble. That true?" No point in lying now. "There's an investigation. A nurse who suspects what I did. I left Philadelphia before they could arrest me." "So you're running. I'm surviving. There's a difference." Jake nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Well, Mrs. Henley, way I see it, what happens between a wife and a dying husband is their business, nobody else's. You do good work at the Circle M. I don't care what Philadelphia thinks about it." Relief washed over Margaret so powerfully she felt dizzy with it. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You haven't met my kitchen." They rode on in silence as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The light turned golden, then amber, painting the prairie grass in shades of honey and bronze. Margaret had never seen such open country, such vast emptiness that somehow felt full rather than lonely. The Circle M came into view as they crested a low rise. The ranch sprawled across a natural bowl in the landscape, sheltered by gentle hills. The main house was solidly built of logs and rough planks, practical rather than pretty. A barn, corrals, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings completed the picture. It looked like a place where serious work happened, where men lived hard lives and earned their bread with sweat and calluses. It looked, Margaret thought, like a place where a woman carrying the weight of mercy killing might find room to breathe. Jake pulled the wagon up in front of the main house. Before he could move to help her down, Margaret climbed down herself, landing in the dust with more grace than she felt. She looked up at the house that might become her home or might become just another place she failed and had to leave behind. Jake came around the wagon carrying her bag. "Kitchen's through here. I'll show you the quarters and explain the setup. Dinner's at 6 sharp. That gives you about 3 hours to figure out that stove and feed 15 men. Margaret looked at him sharply. 3 hours? That's not much time. No, Jake agreed. But I figure if you had the courage to do what you did for your husband, you've got the courage to face down a temperamental stove and some hungry cowboys. He started toward the house, then paused and looked back at her. In the amber light, his face was gentler than it had been. The hard lines softened. One more thing, Mrs. Henley. I asked Morrison what kind of cook I should be looking for. You know what he said? Margaret shook her head. He said I didn't need someone who could cook. I needed someone who could make a house feel like a home again, someone who understood that food is more than just fuel. Jake's voice dropped. He said I needed someone who knew that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is love someone enough to let them go. Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. She blinked them back furiously. Can you do that, Mrs. Henley? Can you bring some warmth back to this place? Because I've got 15 good men who work hard and deserve better than cold biscuits and colder silence. I've got a kitchen that used to be the heart of this ranch when my mother was alive, when Sarah was alive, and now it's just a room where food happens. He took a step closer, his gray eyes searching hers. I don't care if your biscuits burn or your gravy's lumpy. I care if you can make those men want to come home at night. Can you do that? Margaret thought about the terrible loneliness of the past 7 weeks, about the Philadelphia house that had died along with Charles, becoming just walls and furniture with no life in it, about her own desperate need to be useful, to matter, to give something of value to people who might not know or care what she had done. I can try, she said. I can't promise perfect meals, Mr. Caldwell, but I can promise I'll give everything I have to making this feel like a home. Jake studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Then welcome to the Circle M, Mrs. Henley. Let's see if we can't bring this kitchen back to life. He led her inside, and Margaret Henley crossed the threshold into a new world, carrying nothing but a bag of clothes and a heart full of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could learn to forgive herself by learning to feed men who needed more than food. The kitchen was larger than she expected, dominated by a massive cast-iron stove that looked like it could heat half of Texas, long wooden table in the center, scarred by years of use, open shelves holding mismatched dishes and dented pots, a pantry door standing open to reveal sacks of flour and beans and other staples. Everything was clean but lifeless, functional but cold, a kitchen waiting for someone to remember what it was supposed to be. Margaret set down her bag and rolled up her sleeves. She had 3 hours to prove herself, 3 hours to show Jake Caldwell and his men that a woman who had helped her husband die could also help the living find something worth coming home to. 3 hours to begin the long, hard work of redemption. She walked to the stove and laid her hand on its cold iron surface, feeling the potential warmth sleeping inside it. Then Margaret Henley, widow and mercy killer, began to build a fire that she hoped might warm more than just a kitchen. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret Henley arrived at the Circle M Ranch, and the kitchen had begun to remember what it was meant to be. She rose each morning in darkness, before even the rooster announced dawn. Her small room off the kitchen held a narrow bed, a washstand, and little else, but it was hers. The first private space she had claimed since fleeing Philadelphia. In those quiet pre-dawn hours, She would light her lamp and sit for a moment, listening to the ranch wake around her, the creak of floorboards as cowboys stirred in the bunkhouse, the soft nickering of horses anticipating their morning feed, the wind moving through the cottonwoods like a whispered conversation. Then she would rise and face the stove that had become both her adversary and her ally. The beast had moods, she had discovered. On cold mornings it sulked and refused to draw properly, filling the kitchen with smoke until she learned to coax it with kindness and the right arrangement of kindling. On windy days it roared too hot, threatening to burn everything she attempted. But gradually, painfully, she had learned its temperament, had learned to read the color of the flames, to judge the heat by holding her hand above the surface, to know by instinct when the oven was ready for bread or biscuits or the pies the men requested with touching hopefulness. Her hands, once soft and pale from Philadelphia drawing rooms, had toughened. Calluses formed where she gripped pot handles and kneaded dough. Small burns marked her forearms like a map of her education. Her back ached from bending over the work table, her feet from standing on hard floors from before sunrise until after dark. But something else had happened too, something she had not expected. She had begun to feel useful again, not just necessary, but valued. The cowboys no longer ate in silence, shoveling food with their heads down. They lingered now, talking and laughing, sometimes helping her clear the table without being asked. Young Tom Bradley had taken to arriving early, keeping her company while she worked, telling her stories about his life with an openness that reminded her painfully of the son she and Charles had never had. And Jake. Jake Caldwell remained an enigma, a man of few words and careful distances. But she caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, saw something in his eyes that might have been approval or might have been something more dangerous. He still took his coffee in the kitchen most mornings before the other men arrived, sitting at the table with his account books while she worked. They rarely spoke during these quiet interludes, but the silence between them felt companionable rather than awkward. Margaret was learning to read him the way she had learned to read the stove. The set of his shoulders told her if the day ahead would be difficult. The line of his mouth revealed when he was troubled by something he would not speak aloud. The rare occasions when he smiled, usually at something one of the younger cowboys said or did, made her heart do strange things she tried very hard to ignore. She was a widow in mourning. He was her employer. Whatever understanding existed between them regarding what she had done for Charles, it did not extend to anything more personal, could not extend to anything more personal. That morning, the last day of October, Margaret was rolling out biscuit dough when she heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Unusual for this early hour, the cowboys were still finishing breakfast, mopping up gravy with the biscuits she had just pulled from the oven. She looked up to see Jake rise from the table, his expression shifting to alertness. He moved to the window, looked out, then turned back to the room. "Tom, get the medical kit from my office. Mrs. Henley, I may need your help." Margaret's stomach clenched. Medical help. She wiped flour from her hands, following Jake to the front of the house. A rider was dismounting, and Margaret recognized Ethan Morrison from town, his face flushed with exertion despite the morning chill. "Jake," Ethan called, his voice urgent, "I need to talk to Mrs. Henley. It's important." Jake glanced at Margaret, a question in his eyes. She nodded, and he stepped aside to let Ethan pass. Ethan limped into the kitchen, breathing hard. The cowboys had scattered to their work, leaving the three of them alone. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather-bound book, worn at the edges and marked with water stains. "I found this," Ethan said, holding it out to Margaret, "in the attic, going through Pa's old things. It's your husband's medical journal from 1870. Margaret took the journal with trembling hands. The leather was soft with age, the pages yellowed. She opened it carefully, saw Charles's familiar handwriting, precise and clear, and felt her throat close with emotion. "Why are you bringing this to me?" Ethan's expression was earnest, almost pleading. Because Pa told me about your trouble, about the investigation back east, and I thought, if people could see this, could see what kind of doctor your husband was, what kind of man, maybe it would help." Margaret turned the pages slowly. Entries detailing patients Charles had seen during his time in this region. Detailed notes about symptoms, treatments, outcomes. And then, dated August 12, 1870, an entry that made her breath catch. Patient E.M., age 14, presented with paralysis of lower extremities following severe fever. Local physician recommended cessation of treatment, allowing nature to take its course. Family prepared for imminent death. She read on, her vision blurring with tears. "I cannot accept this prognosis. The boy's eyes still hold will to live. While consciousness and determination remain, there is hope. Have decided to remain and attempt treatment using methods learned from Dr. Wilhelm in Philadelphia. If successful, this could validate theories about nerve damage and recovery that medical establishment has dismissed." Entry after entry documented Charles's work, his frustration when treatments failed, his cautious optimism when small improvements appeared, his joy poorly concealed beneath clinical language when Ethan first moved his fingers, then his hands, then finally sat up unaided. The final entry, dated September 3rd, read simply, "Patient E.M. discharged to family care. Prognosis guarded but hopeful. Lower extremity function may never fully return, but life preserved. Father offered payment. Declined. Some debts cannot be measured in currency. If my work here saves one life, validates one theory, it justifies the entire journey west." Margaret closed the journal and looked up at Ethan through tears she could no longer contain. "He never told me. In 20 years of marriage, he never once mentioned you or this place." "Dr. Henley wasn't one to boast," Ethan said softly. "But Mrs. Henley, this proves something important. It proves he was a man who believed in preserving life, who fought for it even when others said it was hopeless. A man like that, if he asked his wife to help him die, it meant something. It meant the suffering was real and unbearable." Jake, who had been standing silently by the window, spoke up. "Why bring this now, Ethan?" "Because Pa got a letter yesterday from a lawyer in Philadelphia asking questions about Mrs. Henley, whether anyone here knew her, whether she'd mentioned her husband's death." Ethan met Margaret's eyes. "They're still looking for you, ma'am, and Pa thinks they might send someone eventually." Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her feet. She gripped the edge of the table for support. Jake was beside her in an instant, his hand steadying her elbow. "Sit down," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He guided her to a chair, then turned to Ethan. "Your Pa tell them anything?" "Said he barely knew you, that you'd only been through town once or twice. Sent them looking in the wrong direction." Ethan shifted his weight, favoring his good leg. "But Mrs. Henley, you should know, the letter mentioned a nurse named Ellen Brennan. She's given testimony saying she heard you and Dr. Henley talking the night he died, saying she saw you with the morphine bottle." "She was there," Margaret whispered. "Charles had sent her away earlier, said we didn't need her anymore, but she must have come back, listened at the door. The letter said she's claiming you murdered him for his estate." Ethan's voice was apologetic, as if personally responsible for delivering such news. Margaret laughed, a bitter sound. "What estate? Charles left nothing but debts. I had to sell everything just to pay for his funeral and buy a train ticket west." Jake pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his gray eyes intense. "Margaret, look at me." She met his gaze, saw no judgment there, only concern. "This journal Ethan brought, it matters. It shows Charles as a man who valued life, but it's not enough by itself. If they send someone, if you have to face questions, you need more than just character witnesses. You need proof that Charles was suffering, that what you did was mercy, not murder. How do I prove that?" Margaret's voice broke. "How do I prove what was in his heart when he asked me, what was in mine when I said yes?" Before Jake could answer, the kitchen door burst open and Tom Bradley stumbled in, his face white with pain, his left hand cradled against his chest. Blood seeped through his fingers, dripping onto the floor. "Sorry, boss," Tom managed through gritted teeth. "Horse spooked while I was shoeing him. Kicked out, caught my hand against the wall. I think something's broken." Margaret was on her feet instantly. All thoughts of Philadelphia and investigation swept aside by immediate need. She grabbed Tom's good arm and guided him to a chair. "Let me see." Tom reluctantly uncurled his hand. The damage was immediately visible. 2 fingers bent at unnatural angles, already swelling. Blood welled from a gash across his palm where the impact had driven something sharp, probably a nail, into the flesh. Margaret's medical training, learned by osmosis during years of being married to a physician, took over. She had assisted Charles hundreds of times, had learned to recognize compound fractures from simple ones, to assess damage with calm efficiency. But her hands trembled as she reached for Tom's injured one. All she could see was the morphine bottle, the spoon in her hand, measuring death instead of medicine, the awful weight of choosing to end a life instead of preserve it. "Mrs. Henley?" Tom's voice seemed to come from far away. "You all right?" She looked up at his young face, saw the pain there, the trust, saw the same expression that had been on Charles's face when he asked her to help him die. Her vision swam, her breath came short and fast. The room tilted and she grabbed the table, fighting for control. "Margaret!" Jake's voice cut through the panic. He was beside her, his hand on her shoulder, solid and grounding. "Breathe, just breathe." "I can't," she whispered. "What if I hurt him? What if my hands, these hands that killed Charles, what if they only know how to end things, not heal them?" Jake moved in front of her, blocking her view of Tom, forcing her to focus only on him. His hands gripped her shoulders firmly but not roughly. "You didn't kill Charles. You freed him from pain. There's a difference." "The law doesn't see a difference." "Then the law is wrong." Jake's voice was fierce. "Margaret, look at me. Tom needs help right now. Not tomorrow, not after you've worked through your guilt. Right now. And you're the only one here who knows what to do." "You could do it. You must have dealt with injuries before." "Not like you have. Not with a physician's knowledge." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to something almost tender. "I know you're scared. I know what you're carrying. But that boy trusts you. He needs you. And I think, more than that, you need to prove to yourself that your hands can heal as well as release." Margaret closed her eyes, drew in a shaking breath, then another. When she opened them, Jake was still there, steady as stone, his gray eyes holding her together by sheer force of will. "All right," she said, "all right. I'll try." Jake stepped aside and she turned back to Tom. The young cowboy's face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, but he managed a weak smile. "I trust you, Mrs. Henley. If you could save Mr. Caldwell's ornery temper, you can surely fix a couple broken fingers." Despite everything, Margaret almost smiled. She took another breath, then reached for Tom's hand with steady fingers. The medical kit Jake had retrieved contained basic supplies. Bandages, clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey for disinfectant. Not much, but it would have to do. Margaret worked methodically, the way Charles had taught her. First, she cleaned the gash across Tom's palm with whiskey, apologizing when he hissed in pain. The cut was deep but clean, no debris embedded that she could see. She stitched it closed with careful, even strokes, surprised to find her hand steady now that she had committed to the task. Then came the harder part. The broken fingers needed to be set. "This is going to hurt," she warned Tom. "A lot. But it's necessary if they're going to heal properly." "Do what you need to do, ma'am." Jake positioned himself behind Tom, hands on the young man's shoulders, ready to hold him still. Ethan moved to help, gripping Tom's forearm to keep it from jerking away. Margaret felt along the broken bones, identifying the fracture points. Simple breaks, thank God, not compound. If she could align them properly and splint them securely, they should heal clean. She looked at Tom's face one more time, saw the trust there, and felt something shift inside her chest. This was not the same as what she had done for Charles. This was the opposite. This was taking broken pieces and making them whole again. "On 3, she said. 1, 2, 3. She pulled and twisted in one smooth motion. The bones realigned with a sound that made Ethan wince. Tom's shout of pain echoed through the kitchen, but he didn't pass out, didn't pull away. Just gritted his teeth and bore it. Margaret worked quickly now, splinting both fingers with small pieces of wood she had Jake cut from kindling. She wrapped them carefully, firmly, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. When she finished, she sat back, her own hands trembling now from released tension. "You'll need to keep this dry and still for at least 6 weeks, she told Tom. "If you move those fingers before they're healed, they might set crooked." Tom looked at his bandaged hand, then up at her, and his smile was brilliant despite the lingering pain. "You did it, Mrs. Henley, just like a real doctor." "I'm not a doctor, I watched my husband work enough times to know the basics." "Well, you're better than Doc Patterson in town. He set my cousin's broken arm 3 years back, and it still don't bend right." Tom flexed his good hand experimentally. "Thank you, ma'am, truly." After Ethan helped Tom back to the bunkhouse with instructions to rest, Margaret found herself alone in the kitchen with Jake. She stood at the sink, washing blood from her hands, watching the water run pink, then clear. Jake came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You did well," he said quietly. "I was terrified. I know, I could see it. But you didn't let the fear stop you." Margaret dried her hands on a cloth, not looking at him. "When I touched Tom's hand, all I could think about was that night with Charles, the weight of the spoon, the way he looked at me with so much trust, so much hope that I would be brave enough to do what he couldn't do himself. And you were brave enough, that's what matters." "Is it?" She finally turned to face him. "Because right now, Jake, I feel like a coward. I ran from Philadelphia instead of staying to face what I did. I'm hiding here pretending to be just a cook, when the truth is, I'm running from murder charges. Self-defense isn't cowardice, it's survival. What if they come? What if the law finds me here and I have to go back and stand trial?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice held a weight that made her listen carefully. "Then you'll face it. But you won't face it alone." Margaret's breath caught. "Jake, you can't get involved in this. It could ruin you, the ranch, everything you've built. Let me worry about that." He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand fall back to his side. "Margaret, I meant what I said that first day. What happened between you and Charles, that's private, sacred even. Anyone who can't see that what you did came from love, not malice, isn't worth considering. The law might not see it that way. Then the law is blind." His voice hardened with conviction. "I've watched you these past 3 weeks, watched you turn this kitchen into a home again, watched you bring laughter back to men who'd forgotten how, watched you set Tom's hand today with the kind of skill and compassion that can't be faked. Those aren't the actions of a murderer, Margaret. Those are the actions of a woman who understands what it means to truly care for others." Tears threatened again, and Margaret blinked them back furiously. "You don't know me, not really. You don't know what I'm capable of." "I know enough." Jake's gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "I know you had the courage I didn't have. I know you loved your husband enough to set him free from suffering, even knowing what it might cost you. And I know that takes a kind of strength most people never have to discover they possess." Margaret wanted to look away, to break the connection between them, but found she could not. Something was happening here in this kitchen, something that felt dangerous and necessary all at once. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she whispered. Jake's smile was sad. "Because someone should be. Because you deserve kindness after what you've been through. And maybe, if I'm being honest, because I need to believe that what you did was right, so I can stop hating myself for not having the courage to do the same for Sarah." The admission hung between them, raw and painful. Before Margaret could respond, before she could find words adequate to the moment, Jake stepped back, the spell broken. "You should rest," he said, his voice returning to its usual measured cadence. "You've had a difficult morning. I'll have one of the men bring you water for washing up." He left before she could protest, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Margaret stood alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the morning's drama. Blood on the floor that needed cleaning. Breakfast dishes still waiting to be washed. The medical kit to be restocked and put away. And beneath it all, the steady, insistent warmth of something growing between her and Jake Caldwell. Something that terrified her more than any murder investigation ever could. Because falling in love again meant opening herself to loss again. Meant trusting someone with the broken pieces of who she had become. Meant believing she deserved happiness after what she had done. Margaret Henley had helped her husband die because she loved him. The question now was whether she had the courage to let herself live, to accept that mercy and murder were not the same thing, and that perhaps, in this wild Texas ranch, she might find not just refuge, but redemption. She picked up the broom and began to sweep, finding comfort in the simple, honest work. Outside, the ranch moved through its daily rhythms. Inside, a widow who had killed with kindness learned that healing hands could belong to the same person as hands that had measured death. And in the slow accumulation of ordinary moments, Margaret began to understand that Jake Caldwell might be right. That what she had done for Charles, terrible as it felt, might truly have been love in its most difficult form. The journal Ethan had brought still lay on the table, a testament to the man Charles had been. Margaret picked it up, held it close to her heart, and allowed herself to believe that perhaps, someday, she might forgive herself for loving someone enough to let them go. December arrived with cold winds that swept down from the north, carrying the promise of snow and the reality of shorter days. Margaret had been at the Circle M for 2 months now, and the kitchen had transformed completely under her care. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a scent of sage and thyme. Checkered curtains framed the windows, sewn from fabric Tom had brought back from town. A jar of late wildflowers, preserved in sugar water, sat on the table as a centerpiece. The Cowboys had taken to calling the kitchen Margaret's domain, and they treated it with a respect that bordered on reverence. They scraped their boots before entering. They removed their hats without being asked. They spoke more quietly here than anywhere else on the ranch, as if the kitchen had become a kind of sanctuary. Jake still took his morning coffee with her, though their conversations had grown more frequent and more personal. He told her about his childhood in Louisiana, about the family he had lost in ways he did not fully explain. She told him about Philadelphia, about the life she had left behind, carefully editing the painful parts, but giving him enough truth that he could understand who she had been before grief remade her. They did not speak again about what she had done for Charles or about what Jake had failed to do for Sarah. That understanding lived between them like a shared scar, acknowledged but not examined too closely. Margaret had begun to feel something she had not expected to feel again. Not quite happiness, but perhaps the memory of what happiness had been, and the faint possibility that it might be found again. Then, on a gray morning, when frost painted the windows white, Lucas Morrison came riding hard from town with news that shattered her fragile peace. Margaret was kneading bread dough when she heard the horse. She looked up to see Morrison dismounting with unusual urgency, his face grim beneath his hat. Jake emerged from the barn, and the two men spoke in low, intense voices that carried a tone, if not words. Then Jake looked toward the kitchen, and even from a distance, Margaret could read the tension in his shoulders. She wiped flour from her hands and walked to the door, her heart already beginning to race with premonition. Morrison removed his hat when he saw her, twisting it in his hands. "Mrs. Henley, I'm sorry to bring bad news, but you need to know there's a U.S. Marshal in Willow Creek asking questions about you." The world seemed to tilt. Margaret gripped the doorframe for support. "A marshal?" "Name of Thomas Grayson. Came in on yesterday's stage from San Antonio. He's been to the store, asking if anyone knows a Margaret Henley, widow of Dr. Charles Henley. Wanted to know if you'd been seen in the area." "What did you tell him?" Jake's voice was sharp, protective. "Told him the truth as I see it. that Mrs. Henley came through town once, asked about work, and I sent her your way. Didn't volunteer anything else, but didn't lie outright either." Morrison looked at Margaret with something like apology in his eyes. "He said he'd be riding out here today to speak with you, ma'am. Said it was urgent business regarding your husband's death." Margaret felt her knees go weak. Jake was beside her instantly, his hand on her elbow, steadying her. "Come inside," he said firmly. "All of us. We need to talk about this." They gathered around the kitchen table, the bread dough forgotten, slowly deflating on the work surface. Margaret sat with her hands clenched in her lap, fighting to keep her breathing steady. "Tell me exactly what he said," Jake directed Morrison. He was polite but firm. Said there'd been an investigation into Dr. Henley's death, that a nurse named Ellen Brennan had given testimony about the circumstances. He had questions that needed answering, and he'd appreciate Mrs. Henley's cooperation. Did he mention arrest? Margaret's voice came out barely above a whisper. Morrison hesitated. He said he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Said he was here to gather information, not necessarily to make accusations. "But he has the authority to arrest if he decides it's warranted," Jake stated flatly. "Yes." Silence fell over the kitchen. Margaret stared at her hands, seeing them as they had been that night, measuring morphine, committing the act that had brought her to this moment. "I could run," she said finally. "Take a horse, head west, lose myself in the territories where federal law doesn't reach as easily." "No." Jake's response was immediate and forceful. "Running now makes you look guilty, makes it seem like you have something to hide." "I do have something to hide," Margaret said, looking up at him. "I killed my husband, Jake. That's what the law will see. That's what any jury will see. A woman who murdered her husband for his estate." "What estate?" Morrison interjected. "Ethan told me you said Dr. Henley left nothing but debts." "He did, but the law won't care about that. They'll say I did it to be free of him, to start a new life without the burden of a dying husband." Margaret's voice hardened with bitterness. "They'll paint me as a cold woman who grew tired of caring for an invalid and decided to end it the easy way." Jake stood abruptly, paced to the window, then back. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but intense. "Then we give the marshal the truth. We show him Charles's journal that Ethan found. We explain that you were honoring your husband's wishes, not acting against them. A dying man's wishes don't override the law against murder. It's not murder if he asked for it. If he begged for it." Jake leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Margaret, listen to me. I know what it's like to watch someone suffer. I know what it does to you, having to witness pain you can't stop. If this marshal has any decency, any experience with dying, he'll understand." Morrison cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know. Marshal Grayson, he's not just any lawman. Lost his wife to cancer 2 years back. Word is she suffered terribly at the end. Some folks say he understands things that other lawmen might not." Margaret looked up sharply. "He lost his wife the same way?" "So I heard. Don't know the details, but it might mean he'll be sympathetic to your situation." "Or it might mean he'll be harsher," Margaret countered. "If he had to watch his wife die slowly and couldn't help her, he might resent that I had the courage he didn't." Jake returned to his chair, reached across the table, and took Margaret's hand before she could pull away. His palm was warm and calloused, solid against her cold fingers. "Whatever happens, you're not facing this alone. That's a promise." "Jake, you can't get involved. If they arrest me, if this becomes a trial, being associated with me could destroy your reputation. The ranch could suffer. I don't care. You should care. This is your livelihood. These men depend on you." Jake's grip tightened slightly on her hand. "Margaret, I've spent 3 years living half a life, going through motions, keeping everyone at a distance because I was too afraid of losing someone again. Then you came here, carrying your own grief, your own impossible choices, and you showed me that it's possible to keep going even after you've done the hardest thing imaginable." His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "If I abandon you now, I'm the coward I accused myself of being when Sarah died. I won't do it. Whatever the cost, I won't do it." Before Margaret could respond, before she could tell him he was being foolish and noble and everything she didn't deserve, they heard horses approaching. Morrison moved to the window. "That'll be the marshal, riding with someone else, looks like." Jake released Margaret's hand and stood. "Morrison, you can go if you want. No need for you to be part of this." "I'll stay if Mrs. Henley doesn't mind. Might help to have a witness to whatever's said." Margaret nodded mutely, her throat too tight for words. She rose and smoothed her apron, a futile gesture toward composure. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. The knock came firm and official. Jake answered it, and two men entered the kitchen. The first was clearly the marshal, 50 or so, weathered face, keen eyes that missed nothing. He wore a star on his vest and moved with the careful awareness of a man accustomed to danger. But there was something in his expression, a weariness around the eyes, that suggested he had seen more sorrow than violence. The second man was younger, perhaps 30, dressed in Eastern clothes that marked him as out of place in this Texas kitchen. He carried a leather satchel and had the look of a clerk or lawyer. Marshal Grayson removed his hat. "Mrs. Margaret Henley?" "Yes." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I'm U.S. Marshal Thomas Grayson. This is Mr. Peter Wilson, attorney from Philadelphia. We need to speak with you about your husband's death." Margaret's gaze snapped to the younger man. Wilson, the same attorney who had advised her to leave Philadelphia, who had warned her about the investigation. Wilson met her eyes and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Whatever he was doing here, it was not what she feared. "Please sit," Jake said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Mrs. Henley has nothing to hide." The marshal and the attorney took seats at the table. Margaret sat across from them, Jake standing behind her chair like a sentinel. Morrison remained by the window, a silent witness. Marshal Grayson studied Margaret for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Henley, I'll be direct. There's been an investigation into the death of Dr. Charles Henley. A nurse named Ellen Brennan gave testimony that she overheard a conversation between you and your husband on the night he died. She claims she heard him ask you to help him end his life, and that she saw you administer an excessive dose of morphine." Margaret forced herself to breathe. "That's true, all of it." Jake's hand came to rest on her shoulder, warm and grounding. The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're admitting to giving your husband a fatal dose of morphine?" "I'm admitting to helping my husband die with dignity instead of in agony. He had terminal cancer. He was in unbearable pain. He asked me, begged me, not to let him suffer the way his father had suffered with the same disease. So yes, Marshal, I gave him morphine, enough to set him free." The words came out stronger than she expected, carrying a conviction she had not known she possessed. She was not ashamed of what she had done. Frightened of the consequences, yes, but not ashamed. Marshal Grayson's expression remained unreadable. "You understand that what you're describing is murder under Pennsylvania law, possibly under federal law, depending on how the prosecutor wants to frame it." "I understand that the law sees it as murder. I see it as mercy. The law doesn't recognize mercy as a defense for taking a life." "Then the law is wrong." The words came from Jake, sharp and certain. The marshal turned his attention to him for the first time. "And you are?" "Jake Caldwell. I own this ranch. Mrs. Henley works for me." "I see. And you're comfortable employing a woman who admits to killing her husband?" Jake's hand tightened on Margaret's shoulder. "I'm comfortable employing a woman who had the courage to do what I couldn't do for my own wife. And, Marshal, since we're being honest, I should tell you, I'm also a man who ran from murder charges in Louisiana 10 years ago. So if you're going to judge Mrs. Henley for what she admits she did out of love, maybe you should arrest me, too, for what I didn't do but couldn't prove. Sarah died of consumption 3 years ago. Toward the end, she could barely breathe. She begged me to help her, to give her more laudanum than the doctor prescribed. I refused because I was afraid of breaking the law, afraid of what people would think." His voice roughened with emotion. "I let Sarah suffer alone because I chose law over love. You chose differently. Mrs. Henley was braver. She put her husband's suffering above her own safety. If that's murder, then it's the most loving kind of murder I can imagine. Silence fell across the kitchen. Marshal Grayson's expression had shifted, something painful moving behind his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. My wife died 2 years ago. Cancer, like Dr. Henley. The last month it was hell. She asked me to help her, more than once. I told her I couldn't, that it was against God's law and man's law both. He paused, swallowed hard. She died screaming. I held her hand and told her it would be over soon, and she looked at me like I'd betrayed her, like I'd chosen the law over her. The marshal's gaze met Margaret's, and in his eyes she saw her own anguish reflected back. I think about that every day, Mrs. Henley. Wonder if I made the right choice. Wonder if following the law made me righteous or just cruel. I think about it every day, too, Margaret said softly. Wonder if I made the right choice. Wonder if love was enough justification for what I did. But you did it anyway, even knowing the consequences. Marshal Grayson nodded slowly, as if something had been confirmed. Then he turned to the attorney. Mr. Wilson, perhaps you should share what you came to tell Mrs. Henley. Wilson opened his satchel and withdrew several documents. Mrs. Henley, I've been working on your behalf since you left Philadelphia. The investigation has taken some unexpected turns. He spread the papers on the table. First, Ellen Brennan has recanted her testimony. She admitted that doctor. Henley's brother, Thomas Henley, paid her to embellish what she heard. He wanted to contest the will, to claim that you had murdered Dr. Henley for his estate. Margaret's head spun. Charles had a brother? He never mentioned family. They were estranged, had been for years, according to my research, but Thomas learned of his brother's death and saw an opportunity. He assumed there would be a substantial estate, and he wanted to ensure you didn't inherit. There was no estate, only debts. Wilson smiled faintly. Actually, that's not quite true. I found a second will, Mrs. Henley. One Dr. Henley filed with a different attorney 6 months before his death. According to the attorney's notes, Dr. Henley established this will separately because he knew his medical debts would consume everything filed through his primary estate lawyer. He wanted to protect you, Mrs. Henley, by ensuring at least the life insurance remained untouchable by creditors. He was, in his own way, preparing for the possibility that he might ask you to help him die. In it, he left you everything, including a life insurance policy he'd taken out years ago that his creditors didn't know about. It's worth $5,000. Margaret stared at him in shock. $5,000. A fortune, enough to start over anywhere she wanted. There's more, Wilson continued. Dr. Henley also left a letter to be opened only in the event of legal questions about his death. I have it here. He produced an envelope sealed with wax, addressed in Charles's familiar hand, to whom it may concern regarding my death. Wilson broke the seal and read aloud. I, Dr. Charles Henley, being of sound mind though failing body, write this to clarify the circumstances of my impending death. I suffer from terminal cancer. The pain is beyond endurance. I have asked my beloved wife, Margaret, to help me end my life with dignity when the suffering becomes unbearable. If she has done so, it is because I begged her to, not because she wished me harm. Any legal action taken against her for honoring my final request would be a grave injustice. She is guilty only of loving me more than she feared the consequences. If there is any mercy in the law, she will be judged for her compassion, not condemned for her courage. Wilson set down the letter. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret could not speak, could not breathe. Charles had known, had prepared for this exact moment, had tried to protect her even from beyond the grave. Tears streamed down her face unchecked. Jake's hand moved from her shoulder to gently clasp both of hers where they lay clenched on the table. Marshal Grayson cleared his throat. Mr. Wilson, is this letter legally binding? In terms of absolving Mrs. Henley of criminal charges, no, but combined with Miss Brennan's recantation and the medical records documenting Dr. Henley's condition, it creates a compelling case that what happened was assisted suicide, not murder. Given the circumstances, given the clear consent of the deceased, I believe any reasonable prosecutor would decline to press charges." The marshal nodded slowly. "I'm inclined to agree. Mrs. Henley, I came here prepared to possibly place you under arrest pending extradition to Philadelphia. But having heard your testimony, having read this letter, and having my own experience to inform my judgment, I don't believe justice is served by prosecuting you." He stood, and everyone else rose with him. "I'll be filing a report recommending that the case be closed. Ellen Brennan has been charged with perjury and accepting bribes. Thomas Henley is being investigated for fraud. You're free to go, Mrs. Henley. Free to stay here, free to return to Philadelphia, free to do whatever you choose." Margaret could not process the words. Free. After 2 months of running, of hiding, of living in fear, she was free. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. The marshal replaced his hat, then paused. "Mrs. Henley, I need you to know something. What you did, it wasn't easy. It wasn't clean or simple or anything the law knows how to handle. But it was love. I see that now. I wish I'd seen it 2 years ago when it mattered." He turned to leave, then looked back one more time. "Your husband was a lucky man to have someone love him that much. I hope you find peace with what you did, because you deserve it." After the marshal and Wilson departed, after Morrison made his quiet exit with a hand clasp for Jake and a gentle pat on Margaret's shoulder, she sat alone in her kitchen with Jake Caldwell and tried to understand that the weight she had been carrying was gone. "I'm free," she said, testing the words. "I can stay or go. I can live without fear." Jake sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What do you want to do?" Margaret looked around the kitchen that had become her sanctuary, at the herbs hanging from the rafters, the curtains she had sewn, the stove she had conquered, the table where cowboys gathered not just to eat but to laugh and tell stories and feel, for a few moments, like they belonged to something larger than themselves. "I want to stay," she said. "If you'll have me, not just as your cook, but as someone who belongs here." Jake turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw something that stole her breath entirely, not the storm clouds of grief she'd first recognized, but something warmer, deeper, like sunlight breaking through. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. These past 2 months, watching you bring this place back to life, watching you heal from what you've been through, I've come to care for you. More than an employer should care for an employee. More than is probably wise, given everything." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving Charles, but I need you to know that when I think about the future of this ranch, about my future, I can't imagine it without you in it." Margaret's breath caught. She had told herself she would never love again, that the guilt of what she had done for Charles meant she had no right to happiness with someone else. But sitting here with Jake, feeling the warmth of his hand and the sincerity of his words, she realized that Charles's letter had given her more than legal freedom. He had given her permission to live, to love again, to believe that the mercy she had shown him was not a crime, but a gift, and that she was worthy of receiving gifts in return. "It's not too soon," she said softly. "Charles wanted me to find happiness again. He said so at the end. And Jake, I think I could be happy here, with you, if you're patient with me, if you understand that I'm still learning how to forgive myself." Jake's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "I'll be as patient as you need. We'll learn together how to forgive ourselves for the choices we made, the ones we made, and the ones we didn't." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Margaret did not want to. She met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it was gentle and tentative and full of the possibility of healing. When they parted, both breathing unsteadily, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "Stay, Margaret. Not just for now, but for always. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that you deserve every happiness this world can offer." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay." The citizens of Willow Creek did not immediately embrace the news of Marshal Grayson's decision. Word spread quickly through the small town that Margaret Henley had admitted to helping her husband die, and opinions divided sharply. Some, led by the local pastor Reverend Miller, argued that mercy killing was still killing, that no matter how much suffering was involved, Margaret had violated God's law. They whispered in the general store, fell silent when she passed on the street during her rare trips to town with Jake. Others, particularly those who had watched loved ones die slowly and painfully, defended her with surprising fierceness. Lucas Morrison and his son Ethan became her most vocal advocates, telling anyone who would listen about Dr. Henley's compassion and medical skill, about the kind of man who would fight to save a stranger's child. But the division remained, and Margaret felt the weight of it every time she left the ranch. 2 weeks before Christmas, Jake asked her to accompany him to town for supplies. She had been avoiding these trips, sending lists with Tom or the other cowboys instead, but Jake insisted gently that hiding away would only make things worse. They rode in the wagon through cold that bit at exposed skin, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter and tried to quell the anxiety rising in her chest. "Whatever happens," Jake said quietly, "I'm beside you. Remember that." Willow Creek's main street was busy with holiday shoppers when they arrived. Margaret climbed down from the wagon and immediately felt eyes turning toward her. Conversations paused. A woman she recognized from church crossed to the other side of the street rather than pass close to her. Margaret lifted her chin and walked toward Morrison's general store with as much dignity as she could muster. Indeed, Lucas greeted her warmly, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Mrs. Henley, good to see you. Ethan's in the back if you want to say hello." As she browsed the shelves, selecting supplies for the Christmas dinner she was planning, she heard the bell over the door jangle. 3 women entered, including Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they saw Margaret. Mrs. Patterson approached slowly, her expression unreadable. Margaret braced herself for condemnation. Instead, the older woman reached out and took Margaret's hand. "Mrs. Henley, I need to speak with you, in private, if you don't mind." They stepped to a quiet corner of the store. Mrs. Patterson's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I judged you harshly when the news first came," she began. "Thought you were a murderer, plain and simple. But then I remembered my own husband's death 5 years ago." She gripped Margaret's hand tighter. He had a heart ailment. Toward the end, the pain was terrible. He begged me to help him, to give him something to make it stop. I was too frightened, too worried about what people would think, about what the law might do. So I let him suffer. A tear escaped, ran down her weathered cheek. He died screaming my name, asking why I wouldn't help him. And I've carried that guilt every day since. When I learned what you did for your husband, my first reaction was anger, because you were brave enough to do what I couldn't. Margaret's own eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be proud. You loved your husband enough to face the consequences of mercy. That's not murder, Mrs. Henley. That's the hardest kind of love there is." The older woman pulled Margaret into an embrace that smelled of lavender and fresh bread. When they parted, the other 2 women had moved closer. "We all have stories," one of them said softly. "All of us have watched people suffer and felt helpless. Some of us wish we'd been as brave as you." Word of Mrs. Patterson's public defense of Margaret spread through town like wildfire. That evening, as Margaret and Jake prepared to leave, a small crowd had gathered near the wagon. Margaret's heart sank, expecting confrontation. But instead, one by one, people approached to speak with her. A rancher whose father had died of gangrene, a young mother who had lost a child to scarlet fever, an old cowboy who had watched his partner die slowly from a gut wound sustained in a fall. Each had a story. Each carried regret or understanding or both. Not everyone came forward. Reverend Miller stood across the street with a group of parishioners, their disapproval clear. But the crowd around Margaret was larger, and their support was tangible. As they drove back to the Circle M through the gathering darkness, Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. She would never have everyone's approval. Some would always see her as a murderer. But she had found something more valuable than universal acceptance. She had found a community of people who understood that love sometimes required impossible choices, and that mercy, even when it came with a terrible price, was still mercy. Jake reached over and took her hand. "You're going to be all right." "We're going to be all right," she corrected, lacing her fingers through his. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear, the world transformed by snow that had fallen during the night. Margaret woke in her small room off the kitchen and lay still for a moment, listening to the ranch wake around her. Today was more than Christmas. Today was the day she and Jake would marry. They had decided on a simple ceremony in the kitchen itself, the heart of the ranch, the place where Margaret had begun to heal. Reverend Miller had refused to perform the service, but an itinerant preacher passing through had agreed, having heard Margaret's story, and found no sin in it. The Cowboys had decorated the kitchen with pine boughs and ribbons salvaged from town. Tom had carved a small wooden cross that now hung above the fireplace. The table was set for a feast, though the ceremony would come first. Margaret dressed in a simple dress of deep green that Jake had quietly purchased for her in San Antonio. Nothing fancy, but new and clean and hers. She pinned her hair up carefully, then hung Charles's wedding ring on its chain around her neck. She would always carry him with her, but she could move forward too. When she emerged from her room, she found the kitchen full, all 15 cowboys scrubbed and in their best clothes. Lucas Morrison and Ethan, Mrs. Patterson, and several other townspeople who had become allies. Even Marshall Grayson, who had stayed in the area an extra week and decided to witness this moment. And Jake, standing by the stove where they had shared so many quiet morning conversations, wearing a black suit that made him look almost like a stranger until he smiled at her with those familiar gray eyes. The itinerant preacher, a circuit rider named Brother Samuel, stood ready with his worn Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice warm and certain, "we are gathered here to witness the joining of two souls who have known loss and chosen to love again." He spoke of second chances, of the courage it took to open scarred hearts to new possibilities, of the difference between existing and truly living. Then came the vows. Jake took Margaret's hands in his voice steady and sure. "Margaret, I promise to love you not because you're perfect, but because you're real. I promise to honor the choices you've made, the courage you've shown. I promise never to ask you to face pain alone. And I promise to build with you a life that honors both the past we carry and the future we choose." Margaret's voice trembled as she spoke. "Jake, I promise to love you with the kind of honesty that comes from knowing life is precious and uncertain. I promise to make this ranch a home where people find warmth and acceptance. I promise not to let guilt or fear keep me from the happiness you offer. And I promise that every meal I cook, every fire I build, will be an act of love for you and for this life we're creating." Brother Samuel smiled. "Then by the power vested in me, and with the blessing of all gathered here, I pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride." Jake pulled Margaret close and kissed her deeply, and the kitchen erupted in cheers and applause. Cowboys whooped and stamped their feet. Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. The feast that followed was everything Margaret had hoped. Roasted beef and chicken, fresh bread and butter, vegetables from the root cellar, and pies, so many pies, because the Cowboys had requested their favorites, and she had made them all. As the meal progressed, the formality gave way to warmth and laughter. Tom Bradley stood and raised his glass. "To Mrs. Caldwell, who turned our cook shack into a home and taught us that family isn't just blood, it's who shows up when you need them." Others followed with toasts and stories. Lucas Morrison spoke of Dr. Henley's compassion and Margaret's strength. Marshall Grayson, surprising everyone, talked about how witnessing true love had helped him make peace with his own wife's death. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching snow fall in the darkness. Jake came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Happy?" he asked. "More than I thought possible," she admitted. "When I came here, I was running from everything. Now I'm running toward something, toward a future, toward hope, toward home." Yes, home. They stood together in comfortable silence, the kitchen warm behind them, the winter night soft beyond the window. 1 year later, on a December evening very much like that wedding night, Margaret stood in the same spot at the kitchen window. But now her belly was round with pregnancy, and the kitchen behind her was full of laughter as the Cowboys celebrated another Christmas. Jake came to her as he often did, his hand resting on the swell of their child. "Thinking about Charles?" he asked gently. He always gave her space to remember, to honor the man who had brought her to this place. "Always," she said, "but not with guilt anymore, with gratitude. He loved me enough to set me free, even knowing what it would cost me. And that freedom led me here, to you, to this." She placed her hand over Jake's on her belly. "If it's a boy, I want to name him Charles Lucas, for the two men who saved me in different ways. If it's a girl, Sarah Grace, for the woman who couldn't have the mercy she needed, but whose memory helped us find each other." Jake's eyes were bright with emotion. Charles or Sarah would both be honored. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, a new life asserting itself. Margaret smiled. This child will grow up knowing that love comes in many forms, that mercy is not weakness, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone go, and sometimes it's learning to hold on again. She turned in his arms to face him. "I killed my first husband because I loved him. I married my second husband because he understood that love. And I'm bringing a child into this world because I finally believe that what I did was not a crime, but a gift." Jake kissed her forehead, then her lips. "You gave Charles peace. You gave me hope. You gave this ranch a heart again. Now you're giving us a child. Margaret Caldwell, you're the strongest person I know." "I'm the person who learned to forgive herself," she corrected. "That's different from strong. That's just human." As they returned to the celebration, Margaret paused to look around her kitchen one more time. The herbs hanging from the rafters, the cross Tom had carved, the table surrounded by men who had become family, the stove that had taught her patience, the windows with their cheerful curtains. This room had witnessed her transformation from fugitive to healer, from widow to wife, from a woman drowning in guilt to one learning to swim in grace. Somewhere, she hoped, Charles was watching and smiling. He had asked her to find someone who made her laugh. She had found so much more. She had found redemption in the simple act of feeding hungry men, found forgiveness in the understanding eyes of a man who carried his own regrets, found hope in the promise of new life growing inside her. The recipe for healing, she had discovered, could not be written in any cookbook. It required equal parts courage and compassion, grief honestly acknowledged and joy tentatively embraced. It required accepting that love sometimes meant making impossible choices and living with the consequences. Most of all, it required believing that a woman who had helped death come gently to one she loved could also help life flourish for others. Margaret Henley Caldwell had learned that lesson in a Texas kitchen, taught by a temperamental stove and a grieving rancher and her own stubborn heart. And as she took her place at the table beside her husband, surrounded by the found family she had fed into existence, she finally, fully, completely believed it. The kitchen was warm, the food was plentiful, the laughter was real, and Margaret, who had once measured death with a spoon, now measured life by the smiles around her table. She was home. 5 years later, on a spring morning, when wildflowers painted the prairie in colors Margaret had learned to name, she stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her daughter, Sarah Grace, toddle after the chickens in the yard. The child had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determination, and she laughed with a joy that knew nothing of the sorrow that had brought her into being. Tom Bradley, now foreman of the Circle M, rode past and tipped his hat. His left hand, fully healed, gripped the reins with the same strength as his right. He had married Mary Beth Morrison the previous summer, and they were expecting their first child in the fall. Ethan Morrison had opened a small clinic in Willow Creek, funded partly by the insurance money Margaret had donated in Charles's name. He treated patients who couldn't afford the fancy doctor from San Antonio, and his limp had become a symbol of hope rather than disability. Proof that broken things could heal and serve purpose. Lucas Morrison still ran the general store, but now with a lighter step. He and Margaret had become close friends, bound by their shared understanding of the gift Charles had given them both, Ethan's life and Margaret's future. Even Reverend Miller had softened. He never publicly retracted his condemnation, but he had quietly attended the baptism of Sarah Grace and stayed for the meal after. Forgiveness, Margaret had learned, came in gestures as often as words. Jake emerged from the barn, saw her watching, and smiled, that rare, full smile that still made her heart lift. Their son, Charles Lucas, napped inside, 3 years old, and already showing signs of his namesake's curiosity about how things worked. Margaret Caldwell had taken the $5,000 from the insurance policy and divided it 3 ways: 1/3 to Ethan's clinic, 1/3 to the ranch's expansion, and 1/3 set aside for her children's education. Charles would have approved. She had finally forgiven herself, not through forgetting what she had done, but through understanding that love sometimes required impossible courage, and that living well was the best way to honor those who had died. The kitchen behind her was warm. The stove had long since become a friend. The table would soon be set for another meal, another gathering of the family she had built from grief and grace. And Margaret, who had once measured death with a shaking hand, now measured life in laughter and wildflowers and the weight of a child on her hip. She had come to Texas running from murder charges. She had stayed because she learned that mercy was the recipe for redemption.